Mexico is not a failed state. The military is still loyal to the government, even though the military has led Mexico's war on drugs because the police are so corrupt, that the military is getting corrupted. The business community doesn't want to see a failed state in Mexico. The middle class doesn't want to see a failed state. But worst of all, the capos don't want Washington to become involved in Mexico the way that Washington is involved in Colombia. President Barack Obama has not shown very much interest in Mexico. He failed to mention that country in his State of the Nation address. Nonetheless, in March, 3 employees of the U.S. consulate in Ciudad Juarez were killed. And all of a sudden, Mexico, which had been a blip on the White House's radar screen, began to assume a higher priority. Our futures are inextricably bound, and I think Mexico, and I say this without indulging in hyperbole, is much more important to the United States than Afghanistan and Pakistan bound together. It's become a war zone. It used to be, it was a big deal when there was a beheading in Mexico. Such an atrocity. How could you imagine it? Now, 2 or 3 beheadings a day probably won't make the front page of a newspaper. The current cartels, especially La Familia and Los Zetas, are making up the rules as they go along. And what they want is impunity, the so-called dual sovereignty. They're happy for elected officials to go about their business, but at the same time, these cartels want to be able to import drugs, process drugs, store drugs, export drugs, but they have branched out into kidnapping, into extortion, into money laundering, into the smuggling of human beings, into loan sharking, into contraband. I'll tell you a gruesome story. The number 2 person in Los Zetas believed that some of the street vendors were skimming money that was supposed to go to Los Zetas. He took some of his thugs with him, went to the boarding house where these street vendors lived, and he lined them up against the wall. And the first one, he beat to death with a baseball bat, starting at the head, moving right down the body. The second one, he took a sharp knife, cut his throat, reached through his thorax, and grabbed his heart and pulled it out. The Mexican cartels have been extremely effective in tunneling under the border. Now they're using those tunnels mainly to transport drugs and illegal immigrants, which can be quite a lucrative undertaking also. Hypothetically speaking, suppose lightning struck and the cartels were no longer making the kind of income that they're making now, and they wanted to diversify even more. And so they rented the tunnels to Al-Qaeda, for example, or to other terrorist groups. We would be extremely, extremely vulnerable. The future of Mexico lies in Mexico, and that's not something that many politically correct people in the United States want to hear, and it's not exactly something that Mexico's elite wants to hear, but I give the same kind of presentation whether I'm in Washington, New York, or Mexico City. And they sort of look at me like I'm brain damaged, and that's understandable, being a pointy-headed college professor. And they will look me in the eye and they'll say, "Fíjate, Jorge, fix yourself on this, George. Tú no entiendes la política mexicana. you don't understand Mexican politics. And I think to myself, I maybe understand a little bit more than you think.